I'm pleased to see all of you here, and I'd like to make a couple of announcements beforehand. First, after this event, there will be a reception, and books will be available for you to purchase in the room immediately behind your breakout room. So I hope that you will join us there. I'd also like to announce two other upcoming events that the Center for the Study of the Southwest is involved in. On Thursday at 9:30 in the Chautauqua room, Dr. Charles Peake, who is here from the University of Nebraska this semester, will be speaking at 9:30 Thursday, this coming Thursday, so you're all invited to that. Then next Monday at 1 o'clock in Flowers Hall, room 114, Dr. Chipman from the University of North Texas, historian, will be speaking about the first Texas governor back in the 1600s, a name that probably many of you have never heard of. So those are two events that are upcoming. Today we are here for a very important event. I'd first like to acknowledge Dr. Jaime Mejia from the Department of English, who did most of the work to get to the many varied organizations together, primarily because many people were interested in being involved and having our guests with us today. Among the sponsors, besides the Center for the Study of the Southwest, are the University Lecture Series, the Therese Kaiser Lindsay Chair of Literature and the Department of English, the Multicultural Student Affairs Division, Multicultural Programs Committee, Image de SWT, and the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. And in fact, the person who will introduce our distinguished guest today is Ray Hernandez, who is the president of Image de SWT. He is a junior from San Marcos, an applied sociology major. So, Ray?
Before we get started, I just want to say thanks to the members of Image SWT for their work throughout the year on bringing not on this but other presenters here to this room. On another note, mention Image SWT and other organizations ask you to join us in the quad tomorrow. We're going to have a solidarity rally which will focus on immigrant bashing, affirmative action, and equality in education via prose readings. And that's at 11:30. Our presenter was born in 1954 in Old Picacho, 42 miles north of our southern border. Born fourth in a family of 7 children, which spoke mostly Spanish at home. He learned his second language, English, in public school, which led him on his passionate journey towards formal education. He received a BA in Humanities at St. Thomas Seminary at Denver, Colorado, a MA in Theology at Louvain in Belgium, and a second MA in Creative Writing at the University of Texas at Basel. In 1987-88, PhD program, University of Iowa, English. 1988-90, Creative Writing, Stanford University, Wallace E. Stegner Fellow, Poetry. 1990-92, Stanford University, PhD program, English. He is currently teaching creative writing with the MFA program at the University of Texas at Basel. He has written 4 books, one of which won the 1992 American Book Award in Poetry for his collection titled Calendar of Dust. Please join me in welcoming a Chicano writer and an inspiration, Benjamin Alire Saenz.
I'm going to start with a poem because it's about one of my obsessions is family. And when I was growing up, I had a lot of uncles, and they were all very interesting people. And each section of the poem is entitled, has their name on it, so you'll know the different sections. One of the second section, Ricardo, I'll just say, just so that you can follow along. My grandmother was a seer, and she dreamed his death, literally dreamed his death. So in that section, just so you know what's going on there. There's a few Spanish in here. And for those of you who don't know Spanish, one of the things my Uncle Bernardo used to say is, cada cabeza es un mundo. Every mind is a world. And the other section is, mira, mijo, somos lo que somos. It means, look, son, we are what we are. Uncles who lie still and perfect. Guillermo. I would fix my eyes on him. He looked right past me. I was a ghost, as we all were, in that slumbering world of his. Sometimes he suspected I was there. I wore white shirts, the only color he could see. Having risen late from a bed he never shared, he sat stiller than his chair. His waking moments were hard. He sat solid, immutable, deflecting the light of a sun that was a heavy burden. He lived for the night and saw darkness pasted to his eyes. No stars there, never any stars. I think he never saw them. The dullness on his face, a milky film, a veil. Not even the flame of his mother's anger nor her impatient love could peel it from his skin. At least he knew she was there. And why shouldn't he know? He lived with her. She scolded him as he handed him a second bowl of soup. Too much drinking, ya basta de tanto trago, te estás matando. Y a mí también, me estás matando. He nodded, almost ashamed, and never answered. His marriage to the bottle lasted 20 years. A union consummated every evening of his youth. And only after that great divorce that left him for the first time alone did he take a wife. He became a man in mourning, the veil never lifting from his face. Many years he kept a cancer, something he brought home from a bar one night and locked it like a treasure in his liver. It pounded him month after month, hit him and hit him until he fell forever in his bed. No liquor to soften the blows, he fought long as he could. Stranger that he was, I keep his picture on an altar in my house. I rise in the morning, his image so familiar, I do not even see it. Now, it is he who's the ghost. Ricardo. The night that man took a brick to your head, your mother slept. But there was no rest for her. She tossed and tossed as she dreamed. She saw you, happy man of her world, your smile more real that moment than her breath. You sat, she saw you, happy man, a pebble in your hand, such joy in simple hopings, the sun surrounding you in familiar embrace. She could see your face strong, her peace in you. Your eyes the same color as the cotton leaves of summer is gone. She watched them close. Then nothing but clouds. Some large shadow came between you and the sun. From where she slept, she cried, "Run!" You could not see what she saw, could not hear her voice. All you felt was the brick pound your skull. When the letter arrived, she did not open it. She had already read the word that spelled your death. My whole life, all I have heard of you is that you were beauty itself. When your name is spoken, it is as if you were in the room, listening. Bernardo. Cada cabeza es un mundo, the basis of his thought. The first philosopher I met in the flesh, the only one I can still quote verbatim. So much Descartes and Hegel in the shaping of my mind, and all their words forgotten. It's true they were smart, true they earned their fame, revered and remembered and argued with respectfully. But what is that to me? What I want to know is, what kind of thinkers were they? There was something in his step that made me think he could dance, though I never saw him gliding over ballrooms. His walk was dance enough. The only uncle I ever imagined having sweet and sweaty sex with his wife of many years. I knew he held her tight and whispered her name again and again until she was safe and asleep. He wasn't ashamed of his mind, of his heart, of his penis. The first anti-dualist, anti-oppositional thinker in 6 or 7 generations. He never hid his body from his soul, and at his peak, he argued down 10 or 20 armchair Gnostics per night at his favorite bar. He carried himself like a plane, daring the wind to blow him out. He never lost his passion for the bottle, yet never lost his mind. I yearn to have his fight, the best of all the graces. Mira, mijo, somos lo que somos. Impossible to live with. He died alone, but did not die unloved. My God, what a heart you had, what a mind. You left no body of work, no written will, not a single letter. What a waste. I've had to settle for reading Plato and Augustine. Benjamin, on the day of his birth, he took a breath, opened his eyes, then closed them tight forever. There was something in the Texas air he could never be at peace with. Too much blood in the dust, too much fire in the sun, too much wind, too much wind. There would never be enough rain. He was born too thirsty. Knowing this, though he was born perfect and good, he died. Many years passed before his surviving older brother, under instructions from a mother who refused to forget, passed down his name to his son. This is how I came to be possessed of his name, which in turn made me fall in love with dead uncles who lie still and perfect, perfect and good in the ground. I wrote a very long essay that's going to be in a collection. And the name of the long essay is called "In the Borderlands of Chicano Identity, There Are Only Fragments." And I'm going to read you a section, some sections of these, and there are reasons for this. You know, I have always found myself, you know, I love Anzalua's book, This Bridge Called My Back. And one of the reasons why I love that book is because I understand what it's like to be a bridge between cultures. Having been born in a very insular, rural, Mexican-American family, and then growing up in a much more sophisticated white culture, and having to go back and forth. And one of the things that we do, I tell my students this, that I do them a great disservice if they don't think about things like racism and antagonism between ethnicities and groups in this country, because they exist. And I think we need to solve them. But we don't solve them by pretending they're not there. We don't solve racism by pretending or telling people that they ought not to be angry. We don't solve racism by pretending that rage does not exist. That's part of the problem. I view this kind of rage in different ways as a professor in a classroom all the time. And part of this essay is a reflection on my own identity as a Chicano, but also in the struggles that all of my students go through, not just my Chicano students, but my white students as well. I'd like to read you, it's not the entire essay, the essay is 32 pages plus endnotes. I won't read it all, I'm just going to read you a few pages. And it's also about my own rage as well. In the borderlands of Chicano identity, there are only fragments. And I have an epigraph from James Baldwin. A bill is coming in that I fear America is not prepared to pay. My wife and I go to an opening reception of the newly opened Barnes & Noble bookstore. We are disappointed because it looks like a mall. What did we expect? The bookstore is full of people who gather around food tables and who gawk through the aisles. People visit and chat with one another. My wife and I look at each other and finally whisper, "There's no one here but white people." El Paso is 70% Hispanic. I hate that word. The west side, where the bookstore was built, is the whitest part of El Paso. The clientele assembled here tonight is decidedly white. My wife and I become uncomfortable. We drink a cup of coffee. We leave. We drive to a book reception. Texas Western Press is celebrating the publication of their latest book. I feel obliged to attend because I am on the editorial board. My wife and I again notice that everyone there is white. What is this, I ask myself, white night? I remember living in Lafayette, Louisiana. There was a blues joint where black people hung out. But on Tuesdays, the blacks would clear out and the place would fill up with white people. The locals referred to Tuesdays in that place as white night. I never knew if the term was used ironically or not. Tonight, I remember that place. We make small talk. There is no big talk at such events. My wife, Patricia, an associate judge, is an associate judge. I am used to attending events with her, and many, if not most, of the people are professional Hispanics. At the reception, my wife and I keep looking around, then nod at each other knowingly. We leave. Why do Patricia and I notice that we are the only Chicanos at these events when nobody else around us seems to notice or care? Why do we notice? And them? Why don't they notice? In response to one of my assignments, one of my undergraduate students casually announced to the class, with no discernible rage in his voice, "I don't read gringo poets." His absolute separatist stance appalled me. I confess I experienced a moment of complete outrage, and I reacted more out of spontaneous reflex than reflective intelligence. My anger was evident, and I made no attempts to hide it. I am not about to put up with racist discourse in this class. Got that? You will read gringo poets, you will read all poets, or you will drop my course. He looked at me quietly. Later, I tell myself that I overreacted. I know what lies behind his words. I have been erased, ergo I will erase. I have been hated, I will hate. There is a compelling logic here. Later, he wrote me a poem in which my person was represented. I was not exactly the hero. I asked him to visit my office. We talked, but we came to no real solutions. The The student, a very dark, Indian-looking Chicano, was disappointed by my response. He was completely disillusioned with me. What kind of a role model was I anyway? Not that he said that, not outright, but his eyes accused. I told him I was not the enemy. But there he was in my office, and he was staring at me, and his eyes kept saying, very definitely, not the real thing, not a real Chicano. I hate playing the game of who is more Chicano than whom. It's a variation on a game currently being played in Washington between Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, who is more middle class than whom. I detest pissing contests. I think about this student. It is tempting to dismiss him, but his rage is very real, and it is a dangerous thing to dismiss rage. Rage never just disappears. It boomerangs back, and if it doesn't hit me, it will hit someone else. I cannot allow myself to forget that I have felt what he feels. I am not free of hate. I am not free of rage with regard to the subject of identity, and I do not really believe anybody else in that classroom is free of rage either. Most of us merely carry our race-based mistrust in a more acceptable manner, especially those of us who are holding very serious dialogues with a dominant culture and have a great deal invested in those dialogues. Some of us deny the relevance of race or ethnic-based identities simply by invoking a democratic-based identity, which is supposed to supersede all other arguments and discourses. We are all Americans. We are all equal. This particular strategy is facile, lazy, anti-intellectual, and has more to do with denial and erasure than it has to do with examining our material culture and how that material culture is decidedly built upon inequalities. I think about this radical student later in the day. His argument is decidedly unsubtle, unnuanced, superficial, reactionary. But the possibility exists that his attitude really offended me because I am embarrassed by the way he handled his rage, which has everything to do with his identity. Why do I find this position unacceptable? Bad politics, very bad politics. And the premises behind the politics, well, those are bad too. I chew on this. I am not so unlike him. I too have been formed by racist discourse, and yet I have just demanded that he not engage that discourse in my class because I find the way he talks about this disagreeable. Knowing, as I do, the very real reasons behind his rage, and knowing, as I do, the way most of my colleagues ignore the material circumstances of our student population, why should he play the role of the accommodationist? Should I shoot the messenger because he has articulated an attitude we all know is just beneath the surface? He did not produce himself. He is a product. And the word product here should not be confused with victim. Though we may all occupy different positions in the material world, we are all the products of the cumulative discourses around us. None of us is as much an active subject as we'd like to imagine. We are all contained by these discourses, especially the discourse of capitalism. And few of us are able to break through a radical talk that is outside of these discourses. All of us make feeble attempts. And isn't this student trying? Some would say that the young man's rage was produced by an inflammatory separatist Chicano rhetoric that does nothing but produce a climate of hatred and mistrust. And this is partially true. Partially true. But this is too easy an answer. Too easy because it masks more complex issues and protects a plethora of guilty parties. When faced with the in-your-face talk of some African Americans, Chicanos, radical feminists, or members of Queer Nation, it is good to remember that one of the reasons this kind of talk bothers us has a great deal to do with the talk we have adopted. We are trained to use a certain discourse, have grown accustomed to using a different kind of grammar. Most of us who teach in universities have been reproduced by tamer, more genteel rhetorics, but it is disingenuous to pretend we are free of violence simply because we appear to have more control over our actions. The pretense of civility in our places of employment, especially in universities, is just that, a pretense. I cannot forget this one important thing. This man has something very real invested in his identity politics. This is serious business. He is fighting back. Maybe I am the enemy. The evening's conversation is easygoing, not too provocative, light. Something you would expect from a dinner party held in honor of a visiting lecturer. Near the end of the evening, the woman seated next to me asks, "Why do you insist on calling yourself a Chicano writer? Why not simply call yourself a writer?" She does not ask the question belligerently, but there is a firm tone behind her question that demands an answer, a challenge perhaps. And yet I know that no answer I give will satisfy the questioner. I take a sip of wine. A series of answers run through my mind. If I called myself a Jewish writer, would you ask me the same question? Would you ask me why I insisted on my Jewishness? If I called myself an American writer, would you ask why I insisted on my Americanness? Too aggressive, I think. Another possible answer, one more mysterious, subtle, more suggestive, more worthy of the writer she imagines me to be. I don't want to call myself anything. I see myself smiling at her. What would she do with that answer? But the answer doesn't suit me. I don't like being in the wisdom business. Far too many poets have bored me with their humanistic wisdom that under serious scrutiny turns out to be as thoughtful as the bridges of Madison County. Another answer races through my mind. Exactly what about the term Chicano bothers you? Clearly the label of writer, an identity label if there ever was one, doesn't bother you a bit. Why not? Isn't writer a problematic identity for you? Why not? But I don't want to get into an argument. And that answer sounds too much like an ambush. Well, I say, finally, I'm comfortable with that identity. I choose it. I say this partially because it's true, and partially because people are comfortable when anything that is being discussed is framed in the terms of choice. Part of a democratic rhetoric we are all steeped in. She doesn't skip a beat. But doesn't calling yourself that limit you? Why would you want to be so limited? Why does it limit me, I ask. Of course it limits me. It limits me because when many whites see that word, they won't pick up the book. Serious readers want to read universal literature, world literature. All writers have their limitations, I say. I'm angry now and I know it. And I know why I am angry, but I also know that I will not go into any diatribes. I do speak passionately, though I am very bad at hiding my emotions. I suggest to her, and by now the entire table, that I have no wish to distance myself from the history of a people I consider to be my community. I tell her that I am unapologetically political. I tell her that this country has no right to demand historical amnesia from its citizens. I praise the memory of my parents who were seasonal cotton pickers. I am romanticizing the image of the farm worker shamelessly. She nods her head, but I see she is not completely satisfied with my answer. I have, however, managed to silence her. Does this mean I have won the argument? She is suspicious of my choice, finds my identity false, though she does not say it. She feels Chicano is divisive and unnecessary and inappropriate political intrusion. Yes, yes, we all come from immigrant stock. Just be a writer and cut the crap. Writer. Now there's an identity. The conversation is lively, but she is not convinced of anything I have said. I assume that Chicano threatens her because it asserts and insists upon difference. Difference for difference sake? Is that what she imagines? And I am equally suspicious of her assumptions. She does not have to discuss her identity. She does not have to hold them up for public debate, for intellectual scrutiny. Doesn't she have an identity? Tell me, what is it like to be white? What are the politics of her chosen identity? I imagine her answer would sound something like this. Come, come, we are educated and civil. We are all the same. We all love, we all hate, we all dream, we all die, we feel, we all feel. I imagine that she tells me this, and I imagine my response. Yes, and some die sooner than others, and some live better than others, and some work harder than others, and some have a great deal more in this world than others. Work makes freedom. Where have we heard that lie? Clearly, work makes some freer than others. As I drive home with my wife, I tell her angrily that sometimes gringos just don't get it. When I call myself a Chicano, I do not do so unproblematically. Do I privilege the culture to which I was born? Yes. Do I do so out of nostalgia? No. Do I over-privilege my culture? Sometimes. Do I resent gringos? Sometimes. Do I hate gringos? No. Do I realize that white or light skin is overprivileged in the country in which I live? Yes. Am I enraged by people who refuse to acknowledge that fact? Absolutely. Am I an essentialist? No. I live on a border between Mexico and the United States. I sometimes sneer, perhaps unfairly, at Latinos who think the border is only a metaphor. What is so radical about using a very material culture as a literary device to describe an individual's psychological state? I know border culture intimately. The anxieties and mistrusts that the very fact of living here raises in the people who live here. But I refuse to romanticize about my culture. I am fond of saying that I don't do hat dances. In my writings, there is no nostalgia. The people represented there are not poor but happy, and they do not lean on cacti. I am not ignorant of other cultures, other traditions, other ways of thinking and talking. I am neither provincial nor insulated nor blind to the other discourses that have formed me. I am not a separatist. I am not an extremist. I wear Chicano as if it were a badge because to live is to take sides. And it does not seem an unreasonable thing to side with the class and the ethnic group that produced me. On the other hand, Chicano identity has nothing to do with particular cultural characteristics that an individual must have or attain in order to be that thing called Chicano. I am not a Neoplatonist. I am not an essentialist. I am not a cultural purist. I realize the pitfalls of identity labels, though I reject such easy metaphors that imply an identity. Any identity is something that is facile, put on like a shirt, and just as easily exchanged depending on the weather the mood or the occasion. Thank you. I'll take questions. If you have any. Yes?
I've always been kind of confused about the actual meanings of the terms Latino and Chicano. Could you clarify that for me, please?
Sure, because it's a confusing thing. Chicano was basically, nobody really knows where the term came from, originated, although there are many theories that perhaps it referred to the Mexica, which were the ancient Aztecs, and it comes from Mexicano, that it would derive from that. It's just a theory. We do know that in the late 18th century, in the middle of the 19th century, Chicanos was a word that Mexicans, people that lived in Mexico City, in the interior of Mexico, referred to people who lived in El Norte, like Texas. They referred to them as Chicanos. It was not a derogatory, it was not a political term. It might have been a derogatory term, though, in a sense, in the sense of that pocho is like you kind of anglicized, or you're not pure anymore, you're losing the culture. So Chicano is very much a term that was adopted in the 60s in the civil rights movement by Mexican Americans. And so a Chicano is a term used to refer to Mexican Americans. But it's also a very, very political identity, I would say. Not all Mexican Americans appreciate being called Chicanos. My father always called himself that, and so we always called ourselves that. And it was Latino is just generically a word used to describe all Latin Americans, as Hispanic is more an umbrella term. It makes no distinctions between Mexican American, Cuban American, Colombian American. It's a general term for Latino culture. It's not specific at all. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes?
From the introduction, I understand the paradigm said English is your second language.
English was my second language.
And there are many people that have said that it's quite impossible to practice.
Well, I think it depends when you learn it. And a lot of people have done it as well. Joseph Brodsky did it, and he came to America much later, and his essays were written. It's difficult, it can be done. English is the language of my education, so it's easier that way because I learned English very young, in first grade. I didn't go to kindergarten, and so it is the language of my education. I became literate in Spanish actually later, though it was my first language. Though there are certain things that when I'm very angry, I lose my English. It's not something I control. And when I pray, because I learned all of my prayers. I was a good Catholic boy. My mother was a very good Catholic lady. I made my first communion and learned all my prayers in Spanish. And therefore I translate. You know, when you say, if I want to pray the Our Father in English, I have to start off with Spanish and then switch to translation. So, Our Father, it's got to start, it starts in Spanish because I go back to these things that are a part of my psychology. Language is I don't study those things. I am more dominant now in English than I am in Spanish. How well Spanish poetry is in English. That's very interesting. I love Lorca and I love Neruda. And I always get the bilingual editions and I always compare. I mean, I get them because I want to compare. I want to know what an English speaker is reading. And somebody say, oh, no. But you know, if you've ever tried translating, and I'm not going to knock it because I tried translating poetry, and it's a very difficult thing. And I have done some translating, and I find that I am never happy with the results. Someone once asked me if I would translate a couple of my own poems to Spanish, and I said, no. Not that I couldn't do it, but it's almost as if I wind up rewriting the poem in Spanish, is what I wind up doing. And I've already finished that work. I prefer someone else to translate it. And I have worked with a translator in trying to work out some of my poems into Spanish. A friend of mine in Mexico City who was doing some translating of my poems. And I think he's actually quite good. But it's, I think of, you know, to think in a language is to think, it's a worldview. A language is a worldview. Because it teaches you to, for instance, one of the examples I like to use in Spanish is we think of Latinos or Hispanics as being children-loving culture. But really, we're as ambivalent about children as many other cultures. And we see that in our language. For instance, there is the romantic way of saying that someone gave birth. And that's dar luz, to give light, which I think is lovely. But there's another way of saying that someone had a baby, that a woman had a baby. And that is aliviarse, to get well, implying she was sick. Those say something about attitudes, and every language is embedded in the words that we use, attitudes towards things. And a lot of those attitudes are ambivalent, shows an ambivalence, if you stop to think about it. I like to say that in English, the car runs. In Spanish, it walks. It's a worldview. It's a way of thinking. It's not just an equivalent. And even our equivalents, when you say, in English we say the apple of my eye, which is a part of it. In Spanish we say mis ojos, it's the whole damn thing. You know, there are, every language has its nuances, its way of saying things, and it's a way of thinking. And we don't, it's a, you know, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, it's an ideology. I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all, but it is. And I think that to that's why to learn, when we learn a language, we know that. If you ever try to learn a language and say, oh, isn't that neat? Because they're expressing something that you know in a completely different way. And so that I think when you know another language, you see the world in a different light. You're not just communicating. It's not just an equivalent thing. And I think that's a good thing.
You talked about being a person who crosses borders in your essay. How do you deal with both poetry and fiction? I know you talked a little bit about moving back and forth and thinking yourself more as a fiction writer, or is it seamless?
Well, no, it's not at all seamless, you know, because I do write I write poetry, I write short stories, I write novels, and I write essays. I have a lot of respect for those genres. I have a lot of respect for instance, when I'm writing a poem, I want to respect my genre. I need to respect it, and the traditions of poetry that I know and that are in me. And when I write an essay, I try to respect that. It's a long literary tradition in the West, and I try to respect it when I work on it. And I always try to do that because I think that they're separate art forms. The reason that I think I move from one art form to another is that I think I don't like to write, for instance, this essay could not be a poem. It's not a poem. It's not a short story. But there are certain issues that I think I have to deal with. I see myself primarily as a thinker, because I really believe that writers are thinkers. I think that's a really important thing for me, that we are thinkers, that we contribute to the way to the formation of this country and the way that we think about ourselves. And it's a very serious thing to be a writer, as far as I'm concerned. And I tell my students, some of my undergraduate students, they go, oh, I want to take a class with you, because I'm tired of thinking. I just want to write. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if you can't think, you're not going to write anything that's worth a damn. It's not as if we're excused from thinking because you're writing a poem. But I do think sometimes, you know, when I'm writing a novel, for instance, I'm writing another novel right now against my better judgment, I just want to write a poem. The other day I was writing a scene in my new novel, and I just said, I can't, I have to write a poem. So I returned to this manuscript that I'm working on. And I sometimes feel a little schizophrenic, but it works for me, you know, moving from genre to genre. And I think I stay truer to my art forms by doing that. And I don't get bored. I never get bored with what I'm doing because of that, because I switch all the time. Yes?
When did you first start writing poems?
When did I first write? I started writing really bad poems when I was in college. Really bad. But you know, it was a training ground. I didn't know it. You know, I think that we're too pragmatic about writing. We're too concerned about product. And I didn't know I was going to become a writer after all. And I was content to write bad poems after a while. And actually, I wound up burning some. They should have been burned, actually. But you know, and I still, by the way, write some bad poems. It happens, you know. Not everything that we write is good, or put it this way, it's good because it serves its own purpose. But not everything that we write should be published. And I think that's part of the wisdom that you gain the more you write, is that you learn that thing called discernment. No, I don't think I should publish this. And I do know some writers who write great things, and they write really awful things, and they publish everything. And I can't do that. I'll just leave the bad stuff in. But I think that I should be free enough to still write bad stuff. Because then it's part of it. I didn't really publish anything until I was in my 30s. You know, at all. It takes a while. You know, I have one student who came into my class, came into my office, and he says, I want to be like this. And he says, I want to break into print in 2 years. And I said, congratulations. That's crazy. I mean, we have to have some integrity about our art forms. And part of what being a student is not, when do I get published? I think the time will come. It's like, do I know my craft? Do I know my craft? Not just, oh, I want to be famous. Oh, what do I say? I want to be famous. You know, I don't know, maybe I should go to Hollywood, but I don't think that a writing workshop is there to help people make them famous. I don't like that. Yes?
Yeah, back to poetry and fiction. Do you feel that, you going back and forth between the two, do you feel that the two genres are very distinct, or do you feel that they're more closely related than a lot of people believe? And I have in mind someone like James Joyce, who fit poetry into his fiction, and a lot of his short stories, some of the rough drafts were actually poems before he transformed them into fiction form, short story form.
Well, I think that they share certain things in common. I do think they're very different ways of thinking. I try to think very concisely and rhythmically. I think in a different way but I have to say that I think that my writing I'm a much stronger prose writer because I'm a poet. You know, I think if anything, my poetry suffers for it. But certainly my my prose gains from it, because that is my that is what I wanted. I mean, I wanted to be a poet. Is what I wanted to be. But then I was writing short stories, writing these other things. But really, it's a great passion. When I read a good poem, I think it says something to me that no story, no novel could move me like that. Though I read all kinds of things. So I do think that they're very different in the way that one thinks about the shape of it. And on the other hand, all writing has to have energy. It has to be concrete. It has to, I think, speak to an audience. Not either a poem or a short story that, it's got to say something. I mean, one way or the other. It can't be just nice writing. I don't like poems that don't say, that are somehow nice, but they don't say anything. I don't like things that, I'm a very emotional kind of guy. I come from a very theatrical family. We're all very dramatic. And I don't like things that lack emotion, that are cold. I'm just like, what's the point? What's the point? I don't care if it's elegantly written or not. There's a lot of writing out there that's perfectly well written and perfectly vacuous. If I don't feel anything in a piece of writing, if I start a novel and I've read 20 pages and I'm still not, I feel real distance. So many books, so little time, I stop reading. I don't read because it's an assignment. I read because it's part of my life. I certainly will stop reading and have stopped reading many things because I don't have to. I'll read something else. I think that thought and emotion have to be an integrated thing in one's writing in order for it to be powerful. Because there's also this kind of real emotional, confessional, vomiting on the page that is, it doesn't move me either. It's like, oh, I don't want to know that, It's like when you meet someone for the first time and they tell you everything about themselves, and then you think like, get away. Or there's the opposite person that you've known them for 10 years and you still don't know a damn thing about them. You think like, both are equally boring. I think that in writing, what you try to be kind of open, you try to reveal, but you try to also conceal a little bit as well. I think you have to kind of meet that balance, and I think poetry is better, I think, in the long run of meeting that emotional balance in good poets because it does so concisely. Yes?
Your poem and love, do you send a message not only to your own brother, but to all people that are from your culture, that the poem that looking at Latino that haven't had the opportunity to go as well?
Yeah, I really am. I think we should be an educated people. However, I also know that education in and of itself is not going to save us. Because places of higher education can be very uncivilized. My parents are still some of the kindest people I've ever met. They know how to treat people. They know how to treat people. I have been in institutions of higher learning all of my life. And I have met a great many people that I would call socially retarded. I mean that. They don't know how to treat people. Education didn't save their lives. They're not making the world a better place just by the fact that they're educated. I think we have to be careful when we make education a panacea. It's like it's going to solve everything. It's not. It depends on the kind of education we get. And that education takes place with our openness to learning in any situation. I had a professor whom I respect very much said, I never learned anything from my students. I think that's a very sad statement. I think that's an incredibly sad statement. And if a professor isn't learning anything from his students, then he should get out. Because it has to work both ways. It has to. And I think that some of the some of the education that takes place in institutions is not conducive to civilization and to creating a civil society. And I think that we really have to rethink the way that we educate people in this country, all the way around. I think colleges are, in fact, much better than our elementary and secondary educations. I mean, we drive people out. We make people take 6 classes a day and we talk at them and we wonder why they don't like it. I hated school. I hated school. When I got to college, it was great because I could be like more independent. But I don't remember learning anything in my high school. I think I learned to read before I got there. I don't know that I learned much, except for I learned to censor myself. I learned how to please. I don't think that's it's not necessarily a virtue. But I do think that the Chicano, especially Mexican Americans in Texas, we have a very high dropout rate. And we have to learn how not to keep our people as an underclass. We have been an underclass for so long. I come from farm worker stock. And it's a terrible place to be. It's a terrible place to be. And education is a way out, and that's true too. It's a way out of poverty, but it's not always a way out of inhumanity. I think time is up. Thank you very much.
I'd like to spend an afternoon of civility and passion, and I hope that you will join us in the reception in the Brazier Room immediately behind.